When Pastor Jim asked me to give my testimonial, I realized I've been a Methodist for 85 years, 2 months, and 28 days of my life. That's my entire life. Then it hit me. How do I fit a lifetime of wonderful memories of being a Methodist into 20 minutes? Many of you know how much I love to tell stories of my life. So I'll just begin at the beginning. I hope you all brought lunches. Seriously, I was preparing for this testimony. I began to realize how much God has blessed me and my family over the years. I grew up in Stoughton, Massachusetts, a small historic town 20 miles south of Boston. The town was named for William Stoughton, a notoriously inept governor of the province of the Massachusetts Bay Colony from 1694 to 1699. Prior to becoming governor, he was a virulent presiding judge over the Salem witch trials from 1692 to 1693. I'm not sure why the town fathers chose his name for the city. On a more positive note, however, the town was the site of Dottie's Tavern, where the Suffolk Resolves were written by a group of patriots, including Paul Revere and Samuel Adams. Those Suffolk Resolves are considered by most historians as being the predecessor documents to the Declaration of Independence. Stoughton celebrates its 300th anniversary next year. In 1936, my parents bravely began building this beautiful 2-story, 5-bedroom house located at 16 Churchill Avenue. That's right. My father had graduated from Wentworth College of Architectural Engineering, and he drew up all the plans for their dream home. They started by digging a full basement by hand, using a pick, shovels, and a big sledgehammer. Since the Depression was still raging on, they literally had to build the remaining 2 stories a few boards at a time. By the end of 1938, they had finished the flooring, wall framing, and ceiling rafters for the first floor. It was all open. They decided their home was finished enough for a wedding, and they got married on New Year's Eve in the living room of that house. My uncle was a Methodist minister, and he performed the open-air wedding ceremony on that cold December day. They believed all things were possible through prayer, and believe me, they prayed a lot. 18 months later, on July 1st, 1940, my Methodist minister uncle, his wife, my aunt, and the town nurse delivered me in that same living room area, which was by then enclosed and furnished. Wow. No doctor, no hospital, and I was just delivered by a Methodist minister. 6 months later, I was baptized by that same Methodist minister in that very same living room. My future was clear. I'd be a Methodist forever. My parents were devoted, lifelong members of this beautiful Methodist church in Stoughton. Thanks to my parents' persistent faith and some wonderful Sunday school teachers, I had perfect attendance year after year. I couldn't wait for Sunday mornings to roll around. When I was 8 years old, my parents started giving me a $2 a week allowance. My very own church envelopes came along with it. Every week, $1 went into a church envelope, and $1 was mine to spend. It wasn't until a few years later, while attending church membership classes, that I learned that tithing is not 50% of your income. It later became clear to me what was happening. My mother and father's objective was for me to learn the discipline of cheerful giving and stewardship. It worked then, it's still working today. My parents met in Epworth League, the predecessor to the Methodist Youth Fellowship. From the 7th grade through my senior year in high school, I attended MYF every Sunday night. My parents were MYF counselors for all those years, and I think it was partly to keep an eye on me. My faith in God grew stronger, as did the confidence that His love would always surround me. During the summer of 1957, I was elected president of the New England Southern Conference of Methodist Youth Fellowships, over 100 MYFs. The awesome responsibility of that position strengthened my faith and my commitment to the Methodist Church. Beginning in the 7th grade through my senior year in high school, I also began attending a Methodist summer camp in North Scituate, Rhode Island, a place called Camp Aldersgate. 2 of those 6 years at Camp Aldersgate turned out to be changing for my life forever. For both those years, I met my first Pastor White. Pastor Jim White, obviously not our Pastor Jim, was from the Methodist Church in Connecticut, and he was my cabin counselor. Pastor White brought me closer to God through his spiritual guidance and uplifting prayers, closer than I've ever been before. I guess that's what Pastor Whites do. In that very first year, Pastor White showed me a quiet, secluded place at Camp Aldersgate that was by the lake and called Meditation Cove. I stayed there alone for almost 3 hours because during that time alone, I felt like I was having a conversation with Jesus. I would ask him questions, and he would answer me. It was truly one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. I returned to the cabin with joyful tears in my eyes, and Pastor White didn't say a word to me. He just gave me a hug because he knew my joy. The following year, I was 15 years old, and once again, Reverend Jim White was my cabin counselor. Once again, my life was changed forever. I met a beautiful 14-year-old girl named Janice Cudmore, now known to everybody as Jan Churchill. I quickly learned that she lived 6 miles away from me in the next city of Brockton. My resolve was tested 2 to 3 times a week as I made the 12-mile round trip on my bicycle just to be with her for a few hours. She was a faithful lifetime member of Central Methodist Church of Brockton. So 7 long years later, we were married at that church in June 1962. And no, the wedding was not held in my family's living room. We have spent the last 70 years as life partners ever since we first met on that magical day at Camp Aldersgate. Going back to my high school and college days, there were 2 more Methodist ministers who had a tremendous impact on my journey of faith. Reverend C. Dale White, yes, Pastor White number 2, he was my senior pastor at Stoughton First Methodist Church from July 1954 through the end of June 1961. It is no coincidence that he arrived in 1954 on my birthday, a month before my Camp Aldersgate conversation with Jesus. He helped me to understand what had happened to me in that moment of my life. His spiritual influence led me to consider becoming a Methodist minister. In fact, in my high school yearbook, my pastime was listed as Jan, and my ambition was listed as minister. So what happened? In my junior year at Boston University, Reverend White asked for Jan and I would meet with him to discuss our future plans, particularly about marriage and the ministry. He talked about the sacrifices he and his wife Gwen had made to the ministry over years. And believe it or not, he convinced us that there were many more ways to witness to our faith and share God's love with others than becoming a minister. In 1976, 15 years after leaving our Stoughton church, Reverend White became Bishop C. Dale White, serving as Bishop of the United Methodist Church in New York, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. He was always a fierce advocate for peace and social justice. He traveled the world studying hunger, peace, and justice issues. In the early days of the Iranian hostage crisis, he was part of a 7-member U.S. delegation that traveled to Iran to help ensure human rights were a priority during that troubled time. Bishop White also fought against apartheid alongside Bishop Tutu of South Africa. With all of Bishop White's involvement on the world stage, he was an Iowa farmer at heart, a caretaker of the earth, and a talented gardener, something at least one of our membership here can relate to. During his time in Washington, he was devoted to the creation of community gardens as part of his ministry to the poor and hungry. The second minister that made an enormous impact on my life was a young seminary student that Reverend White had recruited from Boston University School of Theology to serve as our youth minister. His name was Gilbert Caldwell. Reverend Caldwell tried to get accepted into Duke University School of Theology, but was rejected because Duke would not accept black students until 7 years later. So, fortunately for us, he chose Boston University. His assignment to our church was met with some skepticism, to say the least. On Gil and Grace's first Sunday in church, our parents invited them to Sunday dinner at our home, and for almost every Sunday after that. Members of the congregation quizzed my parents after every dinner about what is this new couple like. After my parents' glowing endorsement of them, the Caldwells were welcomed with open and loving arms. In Reverend Caldwell's 2 short years in our church at Stoughton, from September 1956 to June 1958, he provided all of us, young and old, with a living insight into the plight of black people in America. He crystallized the reality of their longtime struggles for social justice and freedom. It was an education we'll never forget. During his tenure at Boston University, he met a very special guest speaker who was a distinguished alumnus of the School of Theology by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Gil became what Dr. King later described him as one of his foot soldiers in the Mississippi Voter Freedom Drive in 1964. In 1965, Gil Caldwell walked side by side with Dr. King in the march from Selma to Montgomery. Ironically, our first Air Force assignment was to Greenville Air Force Base, Mississippi in 1962. During that assignment, from 1962 to 1965, we witnessed firsthand the horrible impact of racism and hatred. The stories that Reverend Caldwell had shared with us earlier helped us to cope with those tumultuous years in Mississippi. The month of June 1962, to go back a little, was an epic time for me and Jan. I graduated from Boston University on June 3rd. Jan and I got married on June 17th, and I entered the Air Force on June 29th, leaving her in Brockton. The next 25 years is our Air Force history. We moved more than 15 times in 25 years. Every time we moved to a new place, the first thing we did was look for the nearest Methodist church to call home. We have changed our church membership 9 times in the last 63 years, finally settling here at Palmdale United Methodist Church 26 years ago, and now we're with our third Pastor White, who arrived, by the way, 10 years ago on my birthday. There is one more major element in my faith journey. I was 8 years old when my mother called her old piano teacher and asked if he would give me piano lessons. He reluctantly agreed on one condition: only if Howard can play the piano better than you did. This turned out to be a godsend because he was also an organist at the local Baptist church and also in the Masonic Temple in Stoughton. In my 7th and final year of music lessons, he somewhat patiently gave me organ lessons. At first, I had trouble mastering the organ pedals in my beat-up old sneakers. He finally said to me, "Just take off those ugly shoes." Problem solved. From then on, playing barefoot became my trademark. One of my greatest blessings was playing the organ one day back in Stoughton. Bishop Dale White and his wife, Gwen, lived in the church parsonage right next door to our sanctuary. They already had 4 children of their own, and they were in the process of adopting a troubled young teenage girl. Gwen had her hands full. She was on the verge of giving up and sending the troubled teenager back to the foster care agency. One hot and muggy New England summer day, and we had them, I decided to play the organ, so I opened up all the windows in the sanctuary and began playing the organ with all the stops open, as loud as it would go. I played one particular hymn that struck a chord with Gwen. That hymn was "Are Ye Able?" Gwen later told me that song strengthened her resolve to keep raising that troubled teenager in a loving Christian home. That teenager later turned out to be a beautiful, loving young woman. On that day, I believe that hymn saved a young girl's life. That is why I have always said I have 2 Bibles in my life that I can always turn to for comfort and spiritual guidance. One is the Bible we are all familiar with. This Revised Standard Version of the Bible is the one I received when I was 12 years old and had completed the required membership classes for membership in the First United Methodist Church of Stoughton. The other is a Methodist hymnal. This one belonged to my father. He loved to sing. He loved to sing old favorite hymns from this book. He was famous for singing them loudly, and I mean loudly. One Sunday, a lady who sat behind my father during the service approached him afterwards to say how much she enjoyed his singing. Her compliment was, "I love your singing. Have you ever thought of taking singing lessons?" Somehow that didn't come out as she intended it, but my mother and I took great pleasure in teasing Dad after that. If I had to pick one hymn that always inspires me, it would be "Because He Lives." Because He lives, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all fear is gone. Because I know He holds the future, life is worth the living because He lives. I would be remiss if I closed without recognizing the greatest blessings God has bestowed upon us in our lifetime. When Jan's family doctor diagnosed her with type 1 diabetes in 1957, he told her that she would probably not live past 30 years old. She's now 84. Back then, Jan informed me that we would have all of our children before she turned 30. kind of an awesome prediction for me. Jan and I raised 3 amazing children, 2 daughters and a son, Kimberly, Lisa, and Keith. We now have 6 equally amazing grandchildren. Our children were all born in military hospitals in 3 different states. Kim was born in Big Spring, Texas in 1965, and she was born with hyaline membrane disease. She spent the next 6 weeks in an incubator. We prayed and got her to bring her home 2 days before Christmas. Jan was 24. Lisa was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1967. Again, we prayed, and this time everything went smoothly. Jan was 26. The clock is ticking. When Keith was 10 years old, doctors discovered he had a birth defect, a coarctation of his aorta. He had open heart surgery at Walter Reed Army Hospital. They cleared the blockage and put a silicone patch on his aorta. In intensive care, 7 hours later, the patch broke loose. They rushed him into open heart surgery number 2. We never prayed so hard in our entire life. As always, God answered our prayers. Keith will be 56 years old in November. God always answers our prayers if we just are patient enough, trust in Him, and listen. That's important. The Methodist Church has always been the centerpiece of our lives and guided us on our faith journey. God bless your lives as much as He has blessed ours. Thank you.